Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to our webinar series on mastering Ftrack's API. Thanks again for joining us. This is session 4, where we're going to be talking about file management and custom location setups in the API, everyone's favorite stuff. In our previous session, we focused on some of the basics first, and then we went to interaction and querying. And thirdly, acting and reacting with events. We have published all previous sessions on YouTube. If you need them, I'll send links into the chat during the presentation today. And the same for this session. It will also be available. I'm Michael Sears. Happy to see you guys in here again. Account manager for the Americas here at Backlight. Been with Ftrack for a good 3 years now. And once again, Seth, who's one of our solutions engineers, helping with delivery. Some of you have seen him on call. Some of you have seen him here. Extensive background in game design, but been with the team for quite some time here over at Backlight and Ftrack as well. As usual, he's going to be running the bulk of the webinar. So go ahead and use the Q&A panel, or there is a questions panel and a chat panel. You can use either, but if you use the Q&A panel itself, then we can answer it live so everybody knows what question we're talking about. But chat is still encouraged regardless, and we'll try to respond in real time. But as usual, we have a dedicated Q&A session at the end for longer answers and stuff that we can just show in real time, which is great. And we know the story at this point. Hope you guys do too. So at this point, let's go ahead and get started. Are we all set, Seth?
Yep, we are good to go. All right, so once again, thank you everybody for joining us. Like Michael said, we'll be looking at our location system and how Ftrack manages files. And this is going to be more of a conceptual webinar. So if your brain has been swimming a little bit from all the code that we presented over the last couple sessions, don't worry, we'll give you a little bit of a breather for this one. But if you are interested in learning more about the location system after this, and we'll mention this again at the end, we do have a more complete webinar that we'll add to the resources. And as well, if this is a topic that's interesting to you from a deep dive perspective, please let us know. We're in the process of thinking about where we continue with the next iteration of our API webinars, and we'd like to spin up some sessions that are maybe more advanced deep dives where we might actually look at how you implement a custom location, developing a storage scenario, or just general plugins in general, and any special topics like that. So if locations and customizing locations is something that you're interested in, please let us know, because we'd love to make sure that we're presenting content that is useful and relevant to the work you folks are all doing. So in just the housekeeping, we're discussing file storage. We'll actually be discussing the location system itself more specifically, and kind of the concepts and just all the moving parts behind a location. As well, we'll be trying to disambiguate some of the terms you might have come across if you've done any research or looked into locations yourself. Things like, what's the difference between a location and a storage scenario? But at the same time, how do these things all work together? Of course, we're Michael and Seth, so we need to reiterate that. So let's dive right in. So the location basics is where we'll start, and there's quite a few different topics we want to cover. So we'll begin at the beginning with what is a location, why do you use it, how does it work in the context of Ftrack and the Ftrack API. So a location is basically the representation of a physical storage location. So you might have an NAS, you might have a cloud bucket, you might have a storage server, you might have a local hard drive that you want to publish your files to. And what the location does is it lets you map that physical storage to a logical name. So if you've looked at the system settings and set up your own location, you'll see things like ftrack.central storage. That's the logical binding to where you would to where your files are going to be published physically. And so the neat thing about that is this is something that's shared server wide. So if you've started Ftrack Connect, one of the first things it'll ask you to do is to set up a storage scenario. That's what you're doing under the hood, is you're giving your location information to your server so that when you start publishing files, it knows where to send them. An interesting thing about locations is that like everything else in Ftrack, they are just an entity, which means they are a first-class citizen. So once you get familiar with working with entities in general, so whether that's tasks or asset versions or any of our other entities, you'll find that working with a location day to day is very similar. Now, as we mentioned, implementing a custom location is its own separate workflow, and that's something again that we'd love to present to you folks if you're interested. So let us know. But yeah, once you're writing tools, once you're writing your own publishers, once you're managing components and files yourself through the API, you'll see that again, it's very similar to how you would work with any other entity in Ftrack. In fact, you can session commit locations, you can publish locations. So anything you can do with an entity, you can actually do with a location. And a location, it could seem like there's a lot going on, and there actually is under the hood. But one of the neat things about the way they're built is they are implemented in different layers, which we'll look at. We'll look at some of those in depth. For example, there is an accessor layer which governs how a file gets from say you have a file on in your local space that you want to publish to a location. There's some transformation that needs to happen to make sure that everything is Ftrack approved, Ftrack friendly. So that's one of the layers you'll implement or that's implemented. And then there's another layer, for example, called the structure, which is the one that gets the most interested. And that basically maps to your file structure on your location. So, what does the path of a file on your location look like? And again, structure is fully customizable. So say you have a specific convention you want to follow, you can implement that in the structure. And the last, I guess, big high concept that these are registered on the server side. So if you've been, as I mentioned, if you've been into your system settings, you'll see that we have settings for scenarios and locations. And that means that they're accessible to everybody on the server, or can be made accessible to everybody on the server. As well, when you spin up a session in the API, like everything else in your system settings, there is a way to access those through the API. So it's not a case of, if you need to write some custom code, you're going to be locked out of that. To Ftrack and the API, it looks exactly like anything else that's registered on the server side and is an entity. In fact, it's probably not a huge stretch to say that you could think of this as working with a custom entity or custom schema. But so, what are some of the benefits of this system? Because one of the things we do get questions about is, hey, this seems a little bit roundabout. It seems like maybe there's a lot going on here. Well, there are some cool things that this provides, and we've already mentioned quite a bit. We've mentioned the layers such as the accessor and the structure, and the plugin and the combination and the integration with Connect. Well, we wrap all that up for you. I'd say that's one benefit is this is all handled for you in the Ftrack API. So there's not a lot of boilerplate you have to write, and the things that you can do with this once you have this set up is, like we mentioned, full customization. So say you have a naming convention that you want to enforce. We talked about this a little bit in the last session where we discussed that, when you might have an event that fires when something is published, or when a file is renamed, and you want to warn somebody that, hey, this doesn't follow the convention. Well, you can actually back this up with your location as well. So your location accessor could do the necessary transforms to enforce a naming convention. And again, we also mentioned custom folder structures. So people can publish, not have to worry that it's going to the right place. You can say, okay, well, if it's this type of file, it goes, it gets this sort of structure, it goes to this place, and we'll actually look at what that looks like. We have a demo later on where we'll show you what a custom structure could look like. So locations are also storage agnostic. So the location itself doesn't really care if on the back end it's pointing to somewhere in the cloud, if it's pointing to local storage, network storage, or even if it's pointing to your own drive. You've probably, if you've been doing some development, you may have actually set up your Ftrack central storage to be somewhere on your local machine. That's still going through a location. It's just mapping to a folder on your own hard drive. Locations can also be configured individually. So if you have a custom location plugin, you can have a set of options, for example, that are either site or machine or even user specific, but it all goes through the same location. So files will start from the same place, they'll end up in the same place, but there are different things that maybe happen on the way based on what's going on this machine specifically. And of course, you get all kinds of file management features. You can track files, you can move files around, you can track versions. and you can manage what we call components. And components are what you attach to a file when you publish it that makes it Ftrack friendly. So if you ever publish something in Ftrack, you've created an asset and you've looked at that asset in the web UI, all the information that we display, that comes from those components, whether it's a file component, or if you have a sequence of images, we have a special one called a sequence component. But this is the thing that again basically exposes your file to Ftrack and lets you do all the things in Ftrack that you can do through the API or through the web UI. And we'll actually talk about components a little bit more in depth later on. So we do have to talk about what a storage scenario is. I've mentioned this a couple times, and if you've gone into system settings or run connect and started it and set this up, you've been asked for a storage scenario. The best way to think about a storage scenario is that it's basically a location that is configurable from our web UI. So under the hood, when you set up a storage scenario, you point out a location, and then you're good to go. Each storage scenario is unique. So when you create a storage scenario, you have, that's a single instance that, can't be replicated again. But you can have multiple storage scenarios that point to the location, because that's essentially what a storage scenario does, is it describes how a location is going to be used. And that sets up some interesting possibilities. For example, it could be identical to a location. So it could just be, essentially a storage scenario could be as simple as saying, hey, expose this location. But it could also describe much more complex scenarios. For example, you could have a storage scenario that governs multiple locations. So if you wanted to say you want to publish per project, for example, you could have a storage scenario that enables per project locations, or per role or per file type location. So while they kind of work hand in hand, they're definitely two separate concepts. And it's easy to think that a storage scenario and a location are the same thing, but functionally they're not. And you're not required to have a storage scenario to work with a location. So what are some of the use cases for all of this stuff? Well, if you've been in production for a while, these will probably all make sense. Multi-site collaboration. So it is possible to have multiple sites that are pointing to one location, or that are pointing to multiple locations through your storage scenario. The freelancers and outsourcers. So nowadays we're probably all working with freelancers and outsourcing. If you want to have a protected space for them to publish to, that's certainly something you can do. And that actually speaks to one of the points further down, is you can also enforce a structure. So say when you're taking outsourced deliveries, there's a specific structure you want to expect. Maybe you have some tools that rely on that structure to move any deliveries into, say, an approved space for production. That's something that you can enforce. And of course, you can use a location as a redundancy or a backup. And this is something, for example, you could do if you had your own publisher. If you're a custom publishing plugin, as you are publishing to your live location, you could also say, hey, shuttle this off to my redundancy or my backup location as well. And of course, locations can be used as proxies for any sort. In fact, that's another way to think about a location, is as a proxy. So let's take a look at what this might look like in action. So for you folks who aren't familiar with Perforce is a version control system that's used quite a bit in games, and we're seeing now used a lot in virtual production. So and at Ftrack, we do have an experimental sort of, well, let's call it a reference implementation of a Perforce location that you can use if you're using Perforce and you want to publish from Ftrack directly into Perforce. So I'll go ahead and stop my share here. Great, and I do apologize for the poor quality of this video, but we'll talk you through it so you can see what's going on. So the first thing you'll notice is that we are starting in Ftrack Connect. So functionally, this is not something that your users will have to know about. You can expose settings because a location is just a plugin, but when it comes to working, what we're doing is we're using Ftrack on the back end to publish, or sorry, Perforce on the back end will receive a publish from this task here. So we set that up in Connect just like you would with anything else, and this is not specific to the Perforce location. Anytime you have a custom location, the publish flow through Connect stays the same. So all I'm doing here is selecting an asset that I want to publish. And like as if you're familiar with this workflow, this shouldn't look like anything you've never done before. We're finding a file. We are giving Connect some information about the file. So we're either creating a new one. You can actually version up just like you would in Stock Connect. So we give it the web playable settings. We give it a name, and again, nothing out of the ordinary here. So just because you have a specific location, you have a specific setup to your users, this is information that they don't really need to know. Their workflow can be relatively unchanged from between different storage scenarios. So we've done the publish, and if we pop over into Ftrack, we see that now we have a version from Connect. We see that we have the Perforce path, and if we go into this is the UI for Perforce. So you'll notice that now we have our file there, which we didn't before, and you'll notice we have a custom structure as well. And this is all governed by the plugin itself. So quick and dirty, but that's the gist of working with a custom location and a custom storage scenario. So back to the presentation. Okay, so now that we have an overview of locations and we've seen how a location actually can work, let's look a little bit more at some of those concepts that we've kind of touched on. So, for example, we mentioned the implementation layers, such as the accessor and the structure. We mentioned that a location is essentially an entity. So, what does that actually mean functionally? Well, so let's start with components, because components are really the key to making all of this work. As we mentioned, a component is the thing that exposes your data to Ftrack and makes everything Ftrack approved. And a component can be thought of basically as an artifact of a publishing process. So as you saw in the video, when you hit the publish button, not only are we sending the published asset to Ftrack, we're actually attaching components to it. So something like a file sequence component, as I mentioned, or a file component, or I mentioned a sequence component, depending on what it is. And that's all that a component really is. A component is just a representation of a file that Ftrack recognizes and knows to expose functionality to. And these components live on what are called asset versions. If you're not too familiar with the way Ftrack works, when you create an asset, so when you publish an asset, you also get what's called an asset version that rides along and contains versioning information. And these asset versions are really kind of the key to everything. So if you ever clicked on the versions button in the web UI and seen all your versions come up, those are all asset versions under the hood. And these are where your components live. Components can actually live in multiple locations, which is a little bit outside of the scope of this webinar, but again, we can talk more about that in our deep dive. And components can really only live on an asset version, because an asset version is, you could think about an asset version as really where the file itself lives, because obviously if you have multiple versions of a file, each one of those is going to require its own asset version. And so each one of those asset versions needs to have the component to, again, represent the file to the Ftrack web UI. So when we're working with components, components are a little different with entities, but they can be interacted with via the API. And again, it's a little outside of the scope of this webinar, but I would direct you to our complete Ftrack webinar, or Ftrack locations webinar that was done by my colleague Lorenzo, that actually walks you through how to interact with components through the API and what the value of that is. And probably the key way you'll do that is through events. So components, like most of the entities and objects in Ftrack, do emit their own events. So for example, on a component add, so when you publish a file, will emit an event. If you remove a file, if you remove a component, will also emit an event that you can hook, just like any other event. If you remember when we looked at actions and events last week, same idea. So you could have a custom event that happens specifically when a component is added or specifically when a component is removed. And again, that would just be an exercise in implementing an action or an event and subscribing to those component specific events. So we mentioned that locations are first-class entities in Ftrack, which means they are exposed to your API session and can be queried and interacted with similar to any other entity. So you could say session.query location, where you can, once you have that object, you can interact with it through different functionality. I mean, a location does have some specific functionality that's tied to things like finding components, to moving files around, to accessing file information. But again, it doesn't look too much like, unlike working with any other entity in Ftrack. We do use Connect to load the plugin, but that actually, again, provides a couple of interesting things. And probably the most useful thing is that when you're developing a location plugin, it's not too different, at least at the boilerplate level, from developing any other custom plugin. And we'll dive more into plugins in the next session. We'll look at a custom location plugin, but that's something to be aware of. Is that once you've stood Connect up and then loaded the plugin, if you're using from there on, you can interact with it directly through your API code. So you don't need to make any calls into Connect itself or anything like that. You can just say session location, go from there. And as we kind of mentioned with components, locations also emit their own events, which, just like anything in Ftrack, you can subscribe to and act upon. And again, a little outside of the scope of this webinar, but we'll discuss this. But again, something we would probably discuss in our advanced topics concerning locations. So now we're starting to get into these specific layers. We mentioned that a location is implemented in layers. So the structure and the accessor being the two key ones. And the structures and accessors are both plugins to the location. So they're written purely in Python. They're very simple, but the thing to think about the actual layers of a location, structure being one of them, is that they're not entities. They're just parts of the location itself. So when you're working with the location as an entity, you can access the structure, you can access things on the accessor, but they're not entities themselves. So you don't have quite the same functionality available to you. So you can't submit or publish a structure or anything like that. It just rides along with your location plugin. And the structure specifically is where you have your entry points for the custom file, so custom folder layout. So for example, as we showed in the Perforce demo, when we publish that file, there are a bunch of subfolders that are created based on the file itself, as well as some of the info that we collected from Connect. That's all something that you can customize. If you do use some of our out-of-the-box locations, they do have their own structures, but again, this is completely customizable. So if there's a specific structure that you need to respect for your project or your site, you have complete control over that. And as we mentioned, also naming conventions. So basically any of kind of the top level information about a file, so folder naming, again, this is all available through a custom structure plugin. And we do actually have some demo plugins I believe on the recipes repo that if this is starting to kind of make you think, pique your curiosity, you please feel free to take a look at that and see how this is all implemented. So we mentioned structure. The other part that really is going to be important for developing a location is the accessor. And as we mentioned, the accessor is where all the magic happens to take a file from pre-published into the Ftrack world. So this is where you define what the actual kind of back end for the location looks like. So if that's a local disk, if that's somewhere on the cloud, if it's a cloud bucket, if it's somewhere on the web. So for example, we have an S3 accessor for Amazon buckets that shows how this works. But again, it's, as we mentioned, a location is pretty agnostic to that. So your accessor can point to anything. As we showed in the demo, in that case, it points to a Perforce repo, but it could as well point to any other type of repository, any other type of storage situation, physical storage situation. So Again, that's completely up to you to implement if you choose to go that route. And this is where you get into the specifics of how an object is written to that storage space. So as we mentioned, this is where an existing resource gets transformed into an Ftrack and a location specific resource. This is where that all happens. And again, this is something you have complete control over. So you don't have to worry about something coming out on the other end not the way it went in. That's definitely a step you control, so you can make sure that your file gets handled exactly the way it should get handled through that process of being exposed to Ftrack. And this interface, this is more of a developer kind of facing topic, but if you've ever worked with say files in Python or OS level functions in Python, you'll find that the interface is very similar to those. So if this is something you're already familiar with, this should make quite a bit of sense working with. And if not, that's something we do recommend you familiarize yourself with. And it's fairly straightforward. The OS level functions in Python, as well as some of the functionality you might find in something like shutil or any of the other like libraries and modules that have that sort of file management functionality. And so that's quick. This is a bit of a whirlwind tour, but if there are any questions about at least what we've discussed here for locations and storage scenarios, please feel free to fire away. We've got quite a bit of time, so we can go as in depth as anybody is interested in.
Give people a couple minutes. You can use the Q&A panel or the chat panel here. Here we go. Thank you, Matt.
So the question is, do you have any kind of diagram of the relationship between locations, accessors, components, etc.? Yes, we actually do. In the developer section, there's a whole section on locations and publishing that talks about everything from what the relationship between an asset and an asset version and an entity look like. As well, we did mention that we have another webinar that's quite a bit more in depth on locations, and that actually does map out how this all works, everything from Ftrack all the way back to disk. So we'll put that in the resources for you. But yeah, that actually does exist.
Thanks a lot, Matt. Give another minute or so for people to ask additional questions.
And as I mentioned at the beginning, if locations are something you're interested in, please let us know, because as you probably started to figure, there is quite a bit more depth that we could plumb on locations. Everything from the deep technical stuff, like was mentioned in the Q&A, what the specific relationship between all the components is, or the components of the system are, all the way down to what does it look like to implement a custom location, and what are some best practices for implementing custom locations, and storage scenarios as well. Storage scenarios really are a kind of their own topic. So
that could be a whole series.
Indeed.
On scenarios. but we're here to help with those. All right, I don't see any others coming through right now, but definitely reach out to myself or your account manager if you have some specific ones, you want to see some more stuff, and we're happy to do it. Thanks again for talking about this. This is super helpful stuff. This comes up quite a lot, so thank you, Seth. This is the 4th out of 5 training webinars for the Ftrack API. The final session is not in 2 weeks. Naturally, it is actually on Monday, just in 4 days on the 16th at the same time, noon Eastern. So you can register for that. What is ongoing and what you can see in the presentation right now is the bi-weekly Ftrack Advice Clinic. That's hosted live. It's more general UI stuff, but we can get into some more nitty-gritty stuff there as well. We cover more general stuff, as I said, but we're here to help with more technical stuff. That will be ongoing. So join us, and we're happy to do stuff live. The next one is not until January 15th for the Ftrack Advice Clinic. So for more general stuff, that'll wait until then. But we don't plan to stop that right now. We're going to want to keep doing it because we like talking to people live. And once again, the final session for this series is on Monday, the 16th. And from the whole team over here, thanks for spending your time with us once again. Hope you all took something away during the training. Look forward to seeing you on Monday. Thanks for asking the question, Matt, and you are quite welcome, Stefan. And we will talk soon. Thanks a lot.